and welcome to Cinema Therapy Reviews. I'm Jonathan Decker, licensed therapist who loves movies. Joining me today is...
Alan Seawright, a professional filmmaker who needs therapy and almost
trauma
zero
work now?
and some trauma work now, because holy crap, that was a lot.
So folks, we're taking a look at Heretic today, where Hugh Grant plays an affable Englishman in Colorado who traps a pair of Mormon missionaries in his house and proceeds to terrorize them with psychological torture. Good times. Surprisingly good times, actually, given that premise.
Yeah, given that premise, I expected to either not enjoy the movie or be deeply offended by it, and neither of those things happened. I enjoyed the hell out of this movie and thought it was actually pretty thoughtful and, shockingly, mostly accurate.
Now, the reason Alan is saying this is because, in case you didn't know, we're both Latter-day Saints. We're both Mormons, both served missions.
So you won't burn in hell.
And if that fact makes you want to reconsider us, we urge you to do the reverse. Reconsider Mormonism based on what you know about us. There's a lot of diversity of thought and politics in our religion, including us.
Join our church. It's the right one.
No, Alan, we talked about this. We're not...
Oh, right.
I'm afraid it was the Mormons. Yes, the Mormons were the correct answer.
I have so many thoughts. It was a slow burn, slow paced, almost a thriller. It really only dipped into horror kind of right at the end, but psychological thriller for most of it.
I'm going to push back slightly on it being slowly paced. Definitely a slow burn, and in terms of like what happens, it takes a while for anything to truly happen, and yet I was engrossed and on the edge of my seat and entertained every second of this movie.
Absolutely. And I'm going to push back on your pushback. It was slowly paced. It was not badly paced. There's a difference.
Oh.
There's a difference between being slow and being boring. Every boring movie feels like it's 4 hours, and there are slow movies that feel like, they're an hour and 20 minutes, which this one did, even though it's a little, I think just barely under 2 hours.
I was really drawn in by the cinematography by Chun Hung Chun. This movie, even though it could have been a play on a stage, feels aggressively cinematic.
It was spectacular. I think there were 4 sets and then just a couple of outside locations. It may have been 5 sets, but I mean, not a lot. It was this close to suffering from a thing that I really dislike in cinematography that's been happening the last 8 or 10 years, which is just, hey, because digital cameras and digital projection are so good, let's just drop everything down so the brightest thing in the room is only like half exposed.
Yeah.
And then everything else is just playing down here. It's like, yes, we can do that, but why? Why would you?
I've seen a lot of missionary movies, and none of them looked like they were a David Fincher joint from the 90s.
Right? Yeah, it was dim and dark, but always readable. And there were a few shots that stood out as absolutely spectacular.
Well, and that's thematically, the film is more doubt than faith. It's a horror film, so there's a lot of darkness and despair, but there's just enough of a sliver of light for hope, potentially in a loving God, and if not in a loving God, in the decency of humanity. Something that I really loved as a Latter-day Saint was a portrayal of the sister missionaries. I'm so used to seeing us in pop culture as being ignorant, idiots, and fanatic. And they were smart, they were courageous, they were sympathetic, and they were deeply compassionate. I loved how they were portrayed.
Very funny, very dark, super interesting thematically, brilliantly acted, by the way, all 3 of the leads. Hugh Grant obviously is going to get the lion's share of the praise, but Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East both absolutely brought it. Chloe East playing, again, a sort of naive, almost cartoonish version of a Mormon at first, but it was believable enough. Like,
I was like, she may be cartoonish Mormon, but I've met her. Like, I've met that I've met that girl at church.
We both went to BYU. We met that girl 20 times. You kind of were that guy a little bit.
I was, yeah.
Honestly, I genuinely enjoyed the film. My only tiny gripe is there are 2 sister missionaries. One of them is a bit more worldly and world-weary and has, seen and done some things and come to her faith through some trials. The other one is your very stereotypical Utah Mormon, grew up in the church in Ogden, Utah, never questioned anything. And she's naive at the beginning, and there's sort of just a switch that flips about 2/3 of the way through the movie where she has been naive and a little bit not smart, and then she starts doing pretty smart things.
Yeah.
It was a harder turn than like a smooth arc into a change of character.
Here's why it worked for me. One, She was directly inspired by the other sister missionary, who is a bit more worldly and a bit wiser and more street smart.
Well, and more book smart.
Right, and to start pushing back and to start fighting back. I think this is the whole purpose, the trade-off between knowledge and innocence. And so the further she steps into knowledge, it's not that she loses her innocence, but she definitely says, okay, who I've been, this ingratiating, nice person, that's not going to work in this situation. I have to play hardball, and I think it's pretty cool to watch. And there's a point in this movie where it really feels like, in terms of the theological debate, Mr. Reed is right. He's the villain, you know, so he does bad things, but it feels like, oh, all of his points are landing. And there's just one moment where the sisters stand up to him and push back. It's enough to suggest when he says, look out for confirmation bias and question everything, that also applies to him.
If you're into this kind of thing, I cannot recommend this movie highly enough. It treats all of the subject matter with respect, I felt, which is interesting for a movie about trapping and torturing Mormon missionaries. I think that's the most respected I, as a Mormon, have ever felt going to the movies.
Yeah, weirdly. That's a really weird poll, but I felt exactly the same. So that does beg the question, Alan, who is this movie for?
This movie is for people who, honestly, people on either side of the theological religious debate. There's a lot of fun stuff to talk about there for both sets of people. And it's honestly just a ripping good time. Even if you don't give two craps about religion or atheism or anything like that, it's a really fun psychological thriller, sort of puzzle box horror mystery thing. It's really fun.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I'm a Latter-day Saint, but I'm also somebody who's super interested in world religions, and I have a healthy, skeptical, cynical side. So I was engaged on like a lot of different fronts here. I do wish on a personal level that the theological debate had been a bit more balanced, because there are several things that Mr. Reed says that I'm like, well, there are answers for that. People may or may not think those are definitive answers or good enough answers, but it would have been a meatier debate than to just let him land so many hits unanswered.
So this movie's for everybody who isn't particularly squeamish.
This movie could have been a solid PG-13 for most of its runtime. There's about 30 combined seconds of short bursts of violence where I'm like, oh yeah, they never get away with that in a PG-13 movie.
Correct. And
but
honestly, it's one of those occasions where, you know, sometimes there's violence for violence sake or nudity or whatever, and it's like, oh, this movie really didn't need that. This movie did. It needed to earn that R because those little bits really amp up the tension for the rest of it.
And most of the squeamishness comes from Hugh Grant going from Notting Hill to Jeffrey Dahmer meets Richard Dawkins. Like it's
Yes. But what can you learn from it outside of, you know, the obvious theological debate stuff, which is fascinating, but maybe not super applicable to your daily life?
I would say this is a film to get you thinking about who is trying to pull the strings in your life and manipulate you. So the questions I have is, one, how is Mr. Reed guilty of the very things he accuses religion of? And how can you recognize and escape the will of a manipulator? And to be clear, I'm not saying he's wrong. I think there's a lot of religious manipulation and spiritual abuse, but it's interesting. The other side can also do that. Two, how do the sister missionaries adapt their approach in order to fight for survival? And three, how can you challenge confirmation bias in yourself and question everything?
Yeah, so super light, easy, you know, fluffy topics to talk about after the film.
You know what's weird though? For such a dark and challenging film, it's surprisingly light on its feet and funny.
Yeah, no, I watched it here in Utah with presumably a predominantly Latter-day Saint audience. Definitely some people in the audience who had been and were no longer practicing. Definitely, given which sets of people laughed at which jokes. All of which I thought were funny, by the way.
Oh yeah, every single one. Alan, it's time to rate the film. What would you give this out of 10?
Man, this is a tough one because, you know, I don't want to give it a 10 just because I feel like giving out 10s is like reserved for, you know, the Lord of the Rings. Like, but man, it's a really good film. It's a solid 9. I'm leaning 10, but it's easily a 9.
You know, I heard a lot of reviewers say it kind of falls apart in the second half. It didn't for me. I'm going to go ahead and give it an 8. The only thing I would have asked for was a bit more balance. But I do think that the balance comes when the sister missionaries show who they are as opposed to debating. I would say 8 out of 10, but it's close to 9. So that averages out to an 8.5. Heretic is awesome.
It is a great movie.
Folks, what did you think of Heretic? Let us know in the comments below if you have seen it. And please like, subscribe, and click the bell so you never miss a review.
So until next time,
Watch movies at the theater.